done.
Yes.
Yes. I need more energy than that this afternoon.
That's excitement.
My name is Frida Ranamosi and I'm a senior programmer here at Tribeca. Thank you so much for coming to the 2023 Tribeca Festival and participating in our masterclass series. It's always exciting when you're at a film festival to offer insights into the industry, and we're lucky to be able to do that for free. So please tell people we have more talks happening for the remainder of the fest. Tell them to come check them out after you listen to this one, which I'm sure will be very, very informative and interesting. So thank you so much for coming out. This is Classics of American Independent Film Are Disappearing. When we were first learning about missing movies and the work that they do, I thought that their work is really prescient as we deal at a time right now where we're seeing movies slowly disappear in other ways. And I think hearing about the journey of these amazing filmmakers will hopefully help us understand the value of preserving media. So I'm really, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the moderator for this conversation, Nair, and I'm going to get off stage now.
So my job is literally to get these guys to tell you all the information. So, which is why I turned my chair a little bit so I can face you guys. So, just very briefly, you probably had a chance to read about our panelists already, so I'm just going to keep this really brief, but I just want to point out a couple of important things so that you know who we're talking to today. Mira, Nair, and Harron. They're two celebrated filmmakers who, in spite of all the obstacles, have managed to accumulate a substantial body of work. Mira is currently involved with a musical adaptation of her film Monsoon Wedding, which is now being performed at St. Anne's Warehouse. And Mary has a film, Dollyland, that just opened this week in theaters, and it's on streaming platforms as well, so make sure you check it out. It premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. And finally, Sue Bodine, the one person you probably, many of you don't know, she's one of the more valuable people in the independent film world. She's part of a law firm called CDAS, C-D-A-S, but most importantly has been a longtime champion of independent filmmakers, helping them to shepherd their productions through a thicket of complications that always arise. So, all right, so let's see if this actually works. Yes. Okay, so that we just talked about. All right. So there's a mythology that has come with the streaming era that anything you want to watch is going to be available anytime you want to watch it. And those of you who are paying close attention know that that simply isn't true. And if anything, the number of films that are available at any given moment has become less and less with each change in technology. It probably hit its peak during the VHS era. Tons of movies that were available on VHS never made their way to DVD or to Blu-ray. And now a lot of movies that have been released on Blu-ray and on DVD are not available in any form streaming-wise. And there was a big wake-up moment for the industry when Netflix put their video rental business, the old red envelopes that people used to get, when they shut that business down, which they're in the process of doing right now, thousands and thousands of titles that were available are no longer going to be available. So, well, we're hoping somebody's going to take over that library of DVDs and make it available somehow. But to make a long story short, there are a lot of reasons why this situation exists, and I'm very briefly going to lay it out so that we can set the stage for the two case studies that we're going to be talking about today. So, why do films disappear? What is it that's creating this crisis? Well, first of all, there's a question of the rights. Who actually owns the movie? And believe it or not, these things change over time. Companies go out of business, declare bankruptcy, get sold from one company to another. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on, it gets even more complicated when you're dealing with the independent films from the era that we're talking about, because so many of the financing structures were so complicated that literally nobody knew who the rights would end up reverting to in any given moment. And not as if that isn't enough, you also got underlying rights, if it's based on a play or on a book or whatever, you know, are those rights still available? And you've also got music rights, potentially, which is something that is going to come up in this conversation. So, okay, so there's the rights issues. There's the materials. Where are they? Many cases, because of all these companies shifting and going out of business and all that other stuff, materials are just gone. You know, what lab are they in? All the labs have gone out of business. What did they do with the negatives? What are, you know, this is another enormous issue. And while we're not going to go into detail about this, suffice to say that the issues are very, very different whether a movie was made digitally or whether it was made on film. And then the cost of actually preserving this material and making sure that it's going to become available in some form or another is pretty substantial. Then there's perhaps the biggest issue that causes the other two issues to be true, which is distributor disinterest. The fact that distributors have a business model, they know what they can afford to put into a particular title in order to make it worthwhile for them and what size audience they believe they're going to have. And because the costs of doing what's necessary to make a film available are so substantial, in many cases, films that you all love, maybe your favorite films of all time, are deemed just simply not to be worth it. So the question is, could there be some sort of business model at some point that could actually sustain putting these movies into the marketplace and making them available on an ongoing basis? So what that brings me to is our case studies today, because interestingly enough, all of these things that I just laid out, the films that were made independently, mostly in the 80s and 90s, are the ones that are most at risk at the moment, in spite of how recent those films feel, because of the nature of how those films were made to begin with. So many of them were put together with these incredibly complicated financing structures that made them films that could get financed and made, but also put them in the position of having these complicated rights structures where then the follow-on is, where are the materials? Who's responsible for it? Where are they in storage? Is anybody paying for it? All of that stuff happens. And so as a result, there was, when we first started Missing Movies, we started looking up titles that had premiered at Sundance as just a starting point to see how big the problem was. And the vast majority of films that premiered at Sundance during the 80s and 90s are simply not available. Mm-hmm. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the scope of the problem. So now we're going to dive right into the specifics. We have two incredible stories here, films that were, really well received and could be considered hits in the time that they were made and released, that somehow managed to fall into this trap of becoming unavailable. And the filmmakers themselves actually trying their hardest to clear them and to make them available again. So we're going to start with Mira's film, and we're going to start by showing the trailer.
Even though we are 10,000 miles away from India, we should not forget our roots, our culture, our tradition, and our gods.
Send her back to the reservation, that's what I'll say.
They're not that kind of Indian. You're gonna need that black guy's name for the insurance.
You all right?
Black, brown, yellow. As long as you are not white, you are colored.
That's right.
All us people of color must stick together.
Right on, brother.
Hello?
Mina.
Hey, what you doing Sunday afternoon?
How
How long you been in Mississippi?
3 years. Before that, I was in Africa.
You kidding?
I'm a mixed masala.
Hot and spicy.
How come they got Indians in Africa?
The British brought them there to build a railway. That's how my grandfather came.
I was born in Uganda. I
country until I was forcibly expelled.
This is my home.
Not anybody. Africa is for Africans.
What is wrong with you, man? You better leave them foreigners alone, boy. They ain't nothing but trouble.
We're just friends.
Oh, did I say any different?
What do you know about him?
This is America, Ma. No one cares.
People stick to their own kind.
So you think I ain't good enough for your daughter, is that it?
The world is not so quick to change.
Well, Miss Masala, racism is passed down like recipes. Now, the trick is you got to know what to eat, what to leave on your plate.
So Mira, you're on.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back in the old halls in which I definitely premiered several films right here. So it's lovely to be here with Missing Movies, and I feel very happy that at least I can tell you one positive story of this great search that can sometimes make a movie come back. With Mississippi Masala in March 2020, the London Indian Film Festival, something out of the UK, asked me for a print of Mississippi Masala to show at a festival. And I, looked high and low for a 35mm print. As Ira says, it was very successful in its day. We had Cinecom financing it. We had, it was Cinecom then sold to MGM, and I hadn't chased it up since then. But when this print was asked for, I began the search and discovered there was only one print to be found in the world, and that was lying on the floor of a Nashville, Tennessee music company called CSAC in 2020 April. What had happened was the film had been financed by Cinecom and then sold after the death of the owner of Cinecom, Stephen Swid. It was sold, the library was sold to MGM, but a part of that library was then sold again to another company called SBK, also owned once upon a time by Stephen Swid, which was a music company. And for some strange reason, the only film that they got the rights for in this CSAC, this Nashville, Tennessee company, was Mississippi Masala. I contacted CSAC, and there's a wonderful guy called Reed Waltz who was running CSAC, and he said, we don't know what we're gonna do with this print. There's nothing we do with film. And I said, can I just have the print for this festival? He allowed us. We showed it in the festival. It won the most popular film of the audience in the festival in 2020. And as a result of that, which was in June 2020, there were a lot of requests for the film in different festivals in different parts of the world. And then, of course, we all know the pandemic hit. And I thought, well, this is a chance. We should now pursue getting this film back. I wrote to Reed Waltz, who was extremely cooperative, and he said, and he spoke to his boss, who was a man called John Johnson, and I met him for lunch, and he met me for lunch in Manhattan, quoting like all the dialogue from several of my movies. I couldn't believe it, and he was like, I can be dark and have money, I can be poor and have no money, but I can't be dark. I mean, I just couldn't believe this guy was actually existed. Anyhow, he took me to lunch, and he agreed that since there was no home in CSAC for a film, that he would give it to me for $1. And I was just amazed. And then, of course, he said, and CSAC said, that we had to get a quitclaim agreement. They had a lot of the paperwork. We had to then figure out where all the negative was, and it was across 3 different labs in Los Angeles at that time. But we had to get my agent and lawyers here, George Sheenshank and Bart Walker, to handle this quit-claim agreement, which is an agreement that Sue will tell us about later, but an agreement that basically indemnifies CSAC, or the company that you're getting the film rights from, against any lawsuits that may or may not happen in the time to come. That I, Mira, Nair, take on that responsibility. That's quite a complicated and a little bit expensive to make this quit claim, because they have to go through several things to make sure that that's legitimate. And it took a few months. We got the quit claim done. I think I must have spent just a few $1,000s, not counting legal fees, to get that far. And then we rounded up all the elements, got it all together, CSAC, we signed the quit claim. They sent us some 18 boxes into my apartment here on the Upper West Side, and I have a place called Iron Mountain where I store all the negatives I own and so on, up in Philadelphia or somewhere nearby. And we went through all these things, kept the right documents, and sent everything for correct storage to Iron Mountain. Meanwhile, it is really the only romantic film that Denzel ever made, and he's a dream in it. And so are Sarita Chowdhury, so are Sharmila Tagore, the great heroine of Satyajit Ray's films. Great comic actors from India. It's an extraordinary cast. Roshan Sage. I don't know how, sometimes I think back on how we got people from different continents in Greenwood, Mississippi for 6 months to make this highly original and very unique kind of tale that still lasted. And while we were getting all this together, we were speaking to Peter Becker, the great lover of movies, Criterion Collection, and he has some of my movies, and I asked him if he'd be interested in this one, and he was immediately interested. And he made a deal with us, which allowed us, and him and Criterion and us, to restore the entire picture in sound as well to 4K, and that cost about $50,000, which they subsumed, and we made a little more money than that from them to give them North American rights for, I think it was, I don't know, 4 years maybe, or some limited amount of time, and us the rights to use this color-corrected 4K, this extraordinary, beautiful restoration in the rest of the world. And now it's part of the Criterion Collection. We opened it in April last year, and it also had a theatrical release in a limited way in this country. But most importantly, the film is vibrantly and beautifully alive, and also incredibly, available. And what I'm trying to do now, beyond North America, once I have a few other titles of my films, also cleaned up like this. Because I was, when we began, Mary, I'm sure will tell you this, I was always the producer and director of my films, and I always had an eye on copyright, not to have the copyright disappear from me, by this. So many films I own copyright for, and many I don't, I can't, because it was studio and this and that. But now I'm trying to do that with some films that are in my hands, so that I can collect a package of my films and then go to these streamers or whoever would be interested in, again, in the classics. They are now considered a cult classic or whatever, to see if we can enter the mainstream with a group of films. Notably also Monsoon Wedding, which is having an entirely new life as a stage musical, which I also directed. As Ira said, it's out in Brooklyn, but we're expecting to go to Broadway in a year or so with the play, and all over the world with the musical. So it would be a great time to have that film also be alive and very easily available. So anyway, that's my story in a nutshell, and I really look forward to hearing Mary's story, and Sue, who's helped so many of us get through the legal hurdles of what this was.
Yeah, I just want to underline, that it's amazing that you managed to pull all this off. It really is. And it's, the fact that you ended up with cooperative people is,
unique,
almost miraculous. But I also want to underline the fact that you said it was $50,000 to get the movie ready in order to have a 4K transfer done. So that, yeah.
Approximately, they said they'd be covering that, and that was the figure that I recall.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I just think it's important for people to hear what we're dealing with in terms of individual titles, just to transfer them to what is potentially exploitable. So yeah.
And possibly because of Denzel and because it was a celebrated film and people wanted it, he paid much more than $50. That enabled us, I mean, this was also a discovery for me to go back into the paperwork of the film and realize that we all deferred our salaries while making that film. You know, I think I made $15,000 on 2 years of work with that film, or more than two, and so on and so forth. So we had the sense of writing down the deferments, which ran into, you know, 150 grand more for me, or like endless amounts. But we had this leftover after 50 that then we shared pro rata amongst the 5 or 10 of us who were owners, you know, who had deferred salaries.
I mean, another really important point, which is that, you know, everybody understands the concept of like where's the original negative or where's the soundtrack or whatever, but you also have to know where the paperwork is. You know, like who's owed what, who's, you know, where are the contracts, where are the music licenses, where, all of that kind of stuff. So
we had 2 producers, Lydia Pilcher and Michael Nozick, and they both had the paperwork. And CSAC, because Swid sold everything, you know, within his own company, so they had the balance paperwork. So we did have the paperwork, which was, it had to be wrangled from everywhere, but we did have it. But, yeah.
All right, so a big success story. This is great. And now we're going to go to a work in progress. And first we're going to show the trailer.
Last night I was at Max's Kansas City. That's the chic hangout for the jet set of the world.
They called it the Factory.
Roger Vadim was there with Jane Fonda. Andy Warhol was there too.
A place to create art.
I'm writing a play and I want him to produce it.
Well, Andy just makes movies now.
Be discovered.
I did my Kim Novak for him and he was very impressed.
And make a scene.
Oh, God, I hate morning. It is morning, isn't it?
There's a very important TV interview going on right now.
Great.
Just leave me the script and I'll make sure Andy gets it.
No.
But in this world where everyone was a superstar,
Andy, I gotta just talk to you for just a minute.
it took more than talent to get attention.
You want to kill all the men in the world? No, I don't think that would be necessary. You know, Andy, I really think you ought to produce the play. You know? Have you finished it yet? It's way too disgusting, even for us. So what does it have to take to get me on TV, huh?
If anyone can make you a star, Andy can.
I mean, you make something out of nothing, Andy.
What makes you think Andy Warhol, the greatest living artist of our time, wants to publish the ravings of a lunatic?
On my way with David Destiny. I shot Andy Warhol. Yeah, I had to. Yeah, he had too much control over my life.
I watched the trailer earlier, and one of the things that hit me right away was at the very end when that title comes up. It's like, I want the soundtrack album. So go ahead, Mary, tell us your story.
Well, it sort of comes on gradually, the realization that your film is missing, you know, and I'm sure you felt the same. At first I thought, how come Andy Warhol isn't on TV anymore? You never hear about him. He used to show on TV. And then, you know, just looking on Amazon, realizing it's only available on DVD. And how come? And then someone wanted to show it at Film Forum, and they said, you know, we're trying to show it, we can't figure out who owns it. I was like, and then again, you know, someone from Rotterdam wanted to, and said, and we can't find a print. So then it became like, I have to do something. I talked to, the film was originally produced by Christine Vachon, Killer Films, but she didn't know who had the rights either. Just a little sidebar is, you know, one of the things that made this period so great for making movies was that there were all these little companies. You know, it's one of those exciting times where, you know, suddenly everything's broken apart, and it's this happened like in music after punk, or in the early days of hip hop, when there's like a lot of little record companies. Well, in this case, there were a lot of little distribution companies. And the problem, which is very exciting, because they would take a chance on first-time directors like me. But of course, all these little companies, most of them either go bankrupt, or they get swallowed up by a conglomerate. And then that's where all the mystery starts. So in the case of Andy Warhol, it was financed and released by a company called American Playhouse, who mainly did TV drama, but for a short time did movies. And they were owned by as I didn't even know at the time, it turned out they were owned by the PBS station WGBH. Anyway, American Playhouse goes out of business, so it just shuts its doors. They sell the rights to Samuel Goldwyn, who, before the movie even comes out, goes out of business, and they sell it to Orion, which released the film and then go out of business right afterwards. And so that was where, you know, sort of the trail stopped. And finally, and I enlisted Sue Bodine, who's been my lawyer forever since that movie, and we started a process, and then, you know, my manager's office, we, you know, really devoted a lot of time to tracking down who owned it and where it was. And it turned out that finally, after, and it took like years, several years to find out what should have been very simple. And I did not keep all the paperwork. You know, I was just so naive and so happy. This is the other problem, you know, so happy to get a film made. And like, I didn't think like, at that point, like a producer. I've learned a lot since. But anyway, we find out that the ownership has, the films that of Orion have gone to MGM. So first we thought we were dealing with MGM, but the actual ownership had reverted to WGBH. And they're wonderful people at WGBH, but it's a bit like the civil service. It's a, you know, public radio, and they do not move fast. And finally, it seemed the big problem was that we had to deal with the music licenses. And at this point, and one of the reasons why I've been embarked on this search was that, again, Criterion had reached out to me and said, we want to show this movie and make it part of the collection. So then I had a real incentive to try and sort this out. So Sue and I have spent years, really, how many years? Last 3 or 4 years calling, and eventually, and then there was the pandemic. And oh yeah, before that, we found that nobody had those music licenses. Killer Films didn't have them. The music supervisor, who's a very famous music supervisor, Randy Poster, didn't have it. We couldn't find them. And it turned out in the end that this woman who was actually very nice and helpful, said, I think they're in boxes, like boxes in our basement, but it's the pandemic and we can't go in and nobody's allowed into the office. So that sort of shut everything down. And then over sort of the last 18 months or so, gradually they've said, yes, we found these. And I think almost, and I'm gonna let Sue take over, you know, the rest of the story, but I was showing Valleyland at Toronto Film Festival, and they reached out and said, you know, we'd really like to show your first movie. It's like, this is a chance that hasn't been seen like probably in 15 years in a theater. And then, you know, I will let Sue tell you how we managed to do this, because when we didn't have all the music licenses. And just the last thing I want to say is that I think for both Mira and I, you know, our films were made, and I think both our films are more relevant now than they were when they started. You know, yours about race and mine about feminism, because when I made Andy Warhol, you know, people didn't want to say I'm a feminist, and this is about a very controversial, radical, brilliant, but also mentally ill feminist, but who still had a lot of important things to say. And like recently, I was just interviewed by a French documentary team about Valerie Solanas. Her Scum Manifesto is still very much in print and online. And I feel like the things that film, and also there's the character who's transgender, in the middle of transitioning, Candy Darling, who's a sort of iconic member of the Warhol Factory. All those, I feel like the film has more to say now. And there's also the actors. It was the first big film role for Jared Harris. I think he's one of the great actors of our time. First film for Justin Theroux. He's in a small part. He didn't even get top billing. He's just like in the credits, but he has actually a substantial part. And I think the best part Lily Taylor ever had, one of the great actresses. Oh, Michael Imperioli, yeah. As you saw on screen. He was a stage actor long before The Sopranos. So I just feel, again, and one thing that breaks my heart is even seeing this trailer and knowing that the only things available are in very bad resolution on YouTube. you can watch the film, but in a really bad version, is that Ellen Kuras, who is a great cinematographer, it's such a, a beautiful, she did such a beautiful looking film. And I really, we will not rest until we get it to be shown again. But Sue can tell you the extraordinary lengths we made to get one screening at Toronto.
Yeah. So in this way, the story kind of parallels what Mira was saying. Okay, because the trick to doing that was, the same kind of version of a quitclaim or an indemnity letter. And really, not to get technical about it, but basically these agreements make it so that the risk that there's somebody out there that's going to sue you, whether it's because you're using their music without their permission, because you can't find the music licenses, or because an actor never got paid and wants to fine you, thinks you're making millions of dollars off of this thing, whatever it is, okay? The people who have the film, and in Mira's case, CSAC, I think, and in Mary's case, WGBH, even if they're the rights holders, they don't really know what rights they have and what rights they don't have. They may have the material or some material, but they don't. That's different than knowing what the actual rights they have is, and they don't want to take any risk. So they demand an agreement with in this case, both these cases, with the filmmaker themselves, okay? The filmmaker doesn't own the rights to the film, okay? The filmmaker is taking on all of the risk of one of these things happening when, in fact, really none of the even potential upside of the film is gonna be going to that filmmaker, okay? Not that any of these were making a lot of money at that time, but if they were, that money would be going to the owners of the movie, not the people who were saying, I'll take the risk, okay? So they're really quite one-sided agreements in that way, but they weren't the only way. I'm sure that was true for you, Mira, it certainly was with Mary, that was really the only thing. And frankly, at the time, I was happy that they agreed to it. Because look, I know Mary doesn't have the ability to pay off millions of dollars of lawsuits if they should be coming after her, And the fact that she was willing, and I think Christine also signed that same paper, that same agreement, the fact that they were willing to put themselves in that position with, I believe, WGBH knowing, whether it was in the back of their mind or the front of their mind, that these two probably couldn't pay any lawsuits if they happened, okay? But the legal liability would be with the filmmakers, and that allowed the owners of the rights to feel like, okay, we can allow them to show the film. And that's what we were able to do with Warhol, so that it could be shown. It was its 25th anniversary, and we wanted to really have it screened at Toronto. And we did have to, unlike the situation I think that you had, Mira, it wasn't like a blanket forever you can have these rights, or it was just you can do this one screening basically, okay? So we didn't think it was going to be that risky to do, and that's what we did. But I would say that that's probably those kind of agreements. At the end of the day, once you've gone through all of the machinations of finding out who actually owns the movie, okay, which has been described here now, and both of these stories actually have good fortune attached to them, okay, in that they were able to find out basically who owned the movie, and there was actually somebody that owned it, that was still in business in some way or another, and was willing to make some kind of a deal, okay? I know other stories, including some audience members here, who've tracked down a film to find out that the owners, the copyright owners, are completely out of business. It was just a very small group of investors that put their money into the film, and the rights had devolved, I think, to some nephew or something of the guy that originally owned the movie, and he didn't have any clue what he had or anything. The fortunate part of that was that he was willing to make a deal to sell the film back to the filmmakers. But if you end up in a situation, not to get too far off base, but if you end up in a situation where you find that your movie is actually owned by some major company that still exists and is in the business of distributing films, then you have the added issue of convincing them that there's some reason for them to actually spend money on the film themselves or to let you spend money on the film. And that is not always easy, especially if it's a major studio. So I don't know what else.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's fascinating that both of you, in one way or another, were talking about MGM, because it seems like from that era of independent films, all the roads lead to MGM. It's like, and part of it just goes to show how complicated it is. I mean, I have a connection to this because I used to work at Cinecom. The reality is that there was a bank called Credit Lyonnais, which was the bank that used to lend all of the money to all of these small distributors in order to make these movies. And at one point, when all of these companies started going out of business, Credit Lyonnais actually said, "Whoa, wait a minute! We now own all of these movies because the loans were defaulted upon." And Credit Lyonnais at that moment had just taken possession of MGM for the same reason, because MGM was going out of business. And so they merged everything together, and that's why everything ends up at one point or another at MGM. But in any case, I knowing how difficult and circuitous all of this can be, I'm curious to, like, where's the starting point for people in the room who are thinking about these sorts of things, the research process to actually find out who owns the rights?
Yeah.
You've been through this a number of times now, so yeah.
Well, and let me just say that it's part of our mission at Missing Movies to educate filmmakers and everyone else who's interested in how to find your missing movie. Okay, and we have some projects going that will help you do that, we think, sometime. But all right, so the easy first step is to do a copyright search with the Library of Congress in Washington. Assuming that the film was at some point registered for copyright, which most movies are. And this is not, I'm not going to go into the legal niceties of what is copyright and what it isn't and all that kind of stuff, but let's just say that that is the repository still where most things do have some kind of record of who the ownership is. Now, when you're talking about films that are 20, 30 years old, that have gone through changes like what we're describing here, it's not always simple. Even that isn't like, it doesn't necessarily tell you what you need to know, okay? Because you can get a piece of paper back from them which says something you already knew, which is who owned the movie when it first got made, okay? And maybe that nobody else bothered to update that file, okay? What's supposed to happen, and what does happen amongst most of the main industry people, is that when copyright distribution rights are sold or go off from one company to another because of bankruptcy, or they sell them or assignment for whatever reason, then the new owners, usually will re-register that with the Copyright Office, because they want that the purpose of registering with the Copyright Office is to put the world on notice that I own this movie. So if you are acquiring a library of films, let's say a company goes out of business and you acquire and you take over their business and there's 300 movies in their library, they're going to want to register with the Copyright Office. And at that point, it's not a single registration. It's, it'll be an attachment to an agreement that lists all 300 films. So that's, usually the first step. I mean, I've seen copyright searches that in and of themselves are kind of like multi-100-page novels, okay? And you need, you need to spend, I need to have one of my younger junior lawyers, it's their project for the year, to actually read through each, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened, and then that happened, and try to follow the thread of how the movie ended up, where it did. Or it may end up at where it did, or it may end up someplace that you contact that company and they go, oh no, we know that something else happened to it and we never registered it, or whatever. So it's certainly not a kind of fait accompli that once you seek out that information that your job is done. But that would be what I would say would be the first natural step to take, because it would at least give you a thread to start off with.
Oh, I should just say, as part of Missing Movies, I've been talking to the Directors Guild because Sue has developed a contract, which she's already had one of her directors sign, which would have clauses saying that the owners of the movie have an obligation to inform the
directors
of when it's sold and whether the copyright has changed hands.
Yeah, that's something that we feel like might be doable because it doesn't cost any money. So the producers when the producers are producing the film, they might agree to put in the contract. Now, of course, they don't always abide by the contracts after they sign them. So it's certainly, again, not a guarantee, but at least it would be something that a director, a filmmaker, because filmmakers are often not the copyright owner. Mira, your ability to hold on to your copyrights is really quite unusual.
In some cases, but good cases.
Yeah. But for many filmmakers, that ends up not being feasible to do, and we can see the financiers are demanding that they own that. So, but that is something that would be helpful, obviously, to be able to know from the beginning exactly who those rights holders were. And then if there's in the contract, it would be the producer, every time the producer enters into a contract with a third party that grants the rights to them, that would be, a notice would be given back to the original filmmaker. So there could be some kind of chain of title that back to the filmmaker, that would be an obligation. So we'll see. I mean, so far I got it into one contract, so.
So that's a perfect segue into just talking a little bit about Missing Movies. All of us on the panel, as well as a number of people who are here in the audience, are part of this newly not-for-profit organization called Missing Movies, with the agenda of bringing this issue to the public and to the industry and trying to figure out ways around it. I'm going to very, very briefly talk about some of the stuff that we're working on, and then we're going to open up for questions. So here we go. In the near term, we're going to be trying to bring attention to the issue, which is, guess why we're here. And this is, to the public, to the press, to the industry. A lot of people don't realize how serious this is. Oh yeah, there was an article in today's Los Angeles Times that actually was completely about this issue. I mean, the fact that they're paying attention to it is pretty amazing. And they actually used the example of Hal Hartley, who has spent apparently the last 15 or 20 years clearing all of his body of work to the point where he finally managed to pull it all together, and now you can see his movies on his own website. That was his solution to the problem. We want to identify threatened films, and this is where I have to say that while we're focused on this idea of that Sundance IFP kind of era of films, there are threatened movies from just about every era, and particularly movies that in some cases never got any sort of real distribution. It's one thing when we're dealing with two movies that are actually quite notorious in a good way, as opposed to movies that really never saw the light of day that might have resonance now that they didn't have at the time that they were made. So what we're interested in is trying to identify in any way possible other films that require us to get behind them in some way. We're working on creating a web tool that steers filmmakers and other stakeholders toward solutions to their problems. So, we're in very early stages of doing that, which a lot of the questions that Sue was just answering will be there in FAQs, and just trying to make sure that people have the tools available to them, because we're not going to be in the business of literally trying to actively cure these problems. We're more in the education area and just trying to get other people involved and give people the tools to be able to do their own work. And collecting and disseminating case studies, 2 of which you just heard, but we're also interested in talking to other filmmakers. We're going to hopefully post these videos on our website so that people can hear more stories about both the successful attempts to do this and the unsuccessful ones, because we know of a number of those where people have been working on this for a really long time and have not managed to clear the rights yet. So that to the extent that we can create pressure from the outside to get people to cooperate, that would be helpful. So you were going to say something?
Well, it just
Yeah.
reminded me to say that, both of these stories, again, have a fortunate ending, sort of, and Mary's didn't quite have that ending yet, but will be, okay? But, there's no, the indemnification letters I was mentioning as a way to, move people off of saying no, it certainly is helpful and so forth, but there's no law that says they have to. So, there are lots of situations that go so far and then it's a dead end. Whoever has the movie, that's it. They're not interested. They don't want to know about it. They don't want to spend the money. They don't want to talk to you. They just pay no attention. And, those are the ones that are really frustrating,
Maybe just throw those into the marketplace and then
wait for somebody to come after
to
you.
sue you.
Yes, that is one possible solution.
Okay, so then long-term, changing industry practices, Mary and Sue already talked about that, about just trying to get the industry to pay attention to this issue and to add clauses to contracts and that sort of stuff. And then a project that Sue's been working on, which is not quite ready for prime time yet, but she's working on it, is to put together a network of pro bono lawyers to make them available to filmmakers to help them sort out these issues. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, we're just at the beginning stages of the initiative, but the idea would be that, because as Ira said, Missing Movies itself is not part of our mission to actually clear movies, okay? So we want to help other people do that. So one of the things would be that if we get this up and running, which I think we will eventually, is that filmmakers could apply to, be matched up with a lawyer who has some expertise and who would make a commitment to work with them for however long it takes, maybe not forever, okay, but to do that. And so that would be something that I think would be really useful for the industry at large. And just one other quick thing to say, because I think maybe sort of goes without saying, but another reason why this era of films is so prevalent in this conversation is because most of, or many, initial distribution deals, okay? You make your movie, you sell it to a distributor. Those deals usually will have terms of something between, let's say, 20 and 25 years or so, okay? So that's when the problems start to become noticeable, okay? Because at first, you've sold your movie to whoever it is that's gonna put it out, and you might wish they did more with it, but you know where it is, you know who owns it. But those deals do expire, and it's when those deals expire that all these issues that we're talking about really start to come into play.
Yeah, and when you sign those deals and they're for 30 years, it sounds like that's so far in the future.
I know, makes you feel really old now that we're at that.
So, last thing, and then we're going to open up for questions, which is that's our website. Just check it out. There's a place where you can donate money if you want. And there's also places where you can make suggestions about movies that you think we should be paying attention to. Lots to read, and it's only going to grow from there. So, so that's the Missing Movies pitch. And now let's answer questions. I bet some of you have. We can actually do this. We're not going to have mics in the audience, so you're going to have to speak up so we can all hear you. I think your hand was up first. Yes. Yep.
Oh, okay. So my question is about current streaming platforms. A lot of times they just this month these titles are being removed. We're getting rid of them, so they're currently accessible and then they won't be very soon. Is there a difference in trying to start from scratch and trying to have those be available after they're removed? Are you starting to
Yeah, it's a good question because it's a new problem. And actually the fact that we're talking about this at this moment means that it's time to start thinking about the future, which is to say that we're talking about a bunch of movies that are already missing. But every movie that's being made now is potentially a missing movie down the road unless we find solutions, right? So yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. And one of the things that we're learning about the streamers is that they have no compunctions whatsoever about just pulling things out of circulation in order to save 10 cents. I mean, literally, because they don't want to pay the residuals. They don't want. I mean, it's like some movies become more valuable to them as a write-off than they are as films that are on their platform, and that's happening really dramatically in the last few months. As Disney Plus and Max and whatever they're calling themselves this week, and they're removing TV shows and movies left and right. And I know that to a normal person that is logical, it doesn't make sense that something is worth more in the closet than it is on your streaming platform. But they've somehow found the formula for tax write-offs being more valuable to them than the movies themselves, and it's a big problem.
I have to say also that when that happens, I mean, and I'm not sure exactly how you would go about finding this out, but there is a difference between some films which are basically still owned by the same company, but they put them into certain, as I was sort of saying, certain kind of rotation. And you might notice that a movie or film will show up on one platform and then be gone, and then all of a sudden it shows up on another platform. And that's most of that is the deal-making piece of it, okay? Is that the true owner is licensing it to Netflix for 6 months, and then they're taking it back, and then they're licensing it to somebody else for 6 months. So I don't know how you find that out, but that's a different fact pattern than, let's say, something that just goes away, okay? And I suppose, again, probably a search would tell you that if something is still being owned by some company, but they're just making an economic decision that, and even, I mean, Criterion does it too. I mean, Criterion takes stuff off and then puts it back on.
The Criterion Channel does.
Yeah. So it is it's just sort of part of the industry, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's gone forever, which is a different issue. If that's the issue, then yeah, then you're in the same place as we're talking about, starting from scratch.
Hi, I have a question for Mary and both of you in terms of copyright. I'm just a layperson out here in the world, and I don't have the savviness of how any of this works on your side, especially with copyright. So you indicated that you have a lot of different copyrights, like for the music. I noticed that you had Jewel and a lot of other artists listed for the music. Now, would you have to get copyright permission from every artist? And if you don't have it, you have to cut that part of the film out and showing? Is that how that works?
One of the questions that we were addressing was, were those original music licenses in perpetuity in all territories, or were they for just like 10 years? Because sometimes somebody will do a limited, and unfortunately, from the ones that have turned up, they're in perpetuity, and they cover also all media. Thank God.
And all the world, and that's why if you have somebody on your film that's a music supervisor. That's what they're going to do. Is they're going to negotiate the deals for you to be able to use that piece of music, and they're going to ask to be able to use it forever, to be able to use it throughout the world. But they don't always get every right like that. So which is why you have to look at that later. But you do need to do it. It's interesting. The music does not have what in copyright is called fair use, which is where you can use a little tiny piece of something and, not worry about the copyright on it, and there are lots of cases about what you can do and what you can't do, but music does not fall into that. So you have to have the rights somehow or another in order to use it.
And think of when you're making something, think carefully before letting somebody give you a 10-year contract.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, for the producers in the room, always get a perpetuity deal, and if you can't afford it, find another piece of music. I mean, because otherwise you're going to end up in this position.
Yeah.
What about translations? Because many of the things that we see, series are translated into other versions with some of the popular. Or are there any issues around translation of your work into another language? That's what I mean, using another language.
Well, for subtitling, that is a particular right that a distributor will get. Okay, so when you sell your film to a distributor, they're going to ask, and actually that was a very big issue for a while at the beginnings of streaming, because Netflix, who were the daddies of it all, mandated that when they bought your little documentary to put on their streaming platform, for $10,000, you had to deliver it to them in 5 languages. Okay, and it's like, now that's sort of over. But yeah, that's a right that goes with the distribution rights.
Yeah, and so if there's nobody alive who has the copyright, then it goes back to the creators?
It will go back to whoever the owner, the creators, from the second that the idea comes to fruition, it belongs to the creator, okay? But most of the movie industry operates that the copyright is then immediately assigned by the creator, who would be the writer, okay, to the company that's producing the film.
We can't really get into the weeds, and let's give some other people a chance.
Yeah.
You were next, and then you, and then you. Okay, go ahead.
Is it me in the red?
Yep.
Yes. I would like to pose this question to Mira, and because you've been lucky with sort of owning the copyrights of most of your films, so what should be the ethics and mores around, especially when a financier in an independent film industry is concerned around owning the copyright? Let's say a financier is fronting money. It's a question about ethics. You as a creator, what do you think is an outcome? Should the investor have the copyright, or you, who's at the helm of?
So I actually was given this tip from my dear friend Jim Jarmusch long time ago, is to as much as possible own your copyright, and it was a light bulb moment, or to as we are all independent filmmakers, to understand what that means, to keep the copyright. And also because when I began Indian here in America, no support systems of any great kind, I began to become pragmatic for my own, to have my own work exist. By that I mean, I was, without thinking of it, became the producer of my own films, So, but this thing about keeping copyright was with me right from the beginning. So even Salam Bombay, which was my first feature, 1987, 1988, I tried to preserve the copyright, but then you have to get your financing. So in every case, even since then, so I had like 3, usually I try to get 3 financiers for each film, so that I own the creative control and they don't. That's just my thing. Versus selling it to Cinecom, who then owns the film, may not own final cut, or may, depending on the deal we make, but they own the film, But in the case of 2 or 3 financiers, I can preserve copyright with it being shared by territory, different territories for each financier. You know what I mean? But whatever way you do it, if you can get your company or yourself to be part of the copyright's shareholder, that's very important, because that's the only time that you can figure out how many years you gave it for to such and such person, or this distributor or that distributor. That's why what I was saying, like now it's 30 years. Most of my films, many of my films are like 35 years old, 31 years old, 25 years old, 20 years old. They have several films. And now they are, because if I chase it all up and it's 25 years, The Reluctant Fundamentalist was 25 years, it will be mine. Or the creative team that will make it will be mine in say 2 years. Then I know that all this began from actually the case of Mississippi Masala, looking for that print. It all began to understand what were the other films facing, what is the future of those films and who owns them. And so I ferreted out what I almost completely can own in say 2 years, depending on the deal, and what I already do own with some financiers who might have negotiated being part of the copyright. But I really try to keep the copyright. to Mirabai Films. I may not make money on it, but 25 years later, when the film is available in the marketplace, then it's mine to see if it could be exploited.
You were iconic as Mirabai.
Okay, we had a question over there, is that right? Yeah.
Hi, I'm very excited to be here, let alone having the opportunity to asking you questions. I'd like to know if these principles and concerns apply to movies made out of the States, especially in countries that face drastic political change, like Eastern Bloc, Soviet, post-Soviet, Soviet, Iran, or places like that. Did anyone show any interest in expanding this entity of lawyers and distributors internationally?
It does exist throughout the world, okay? Some, I mean, there's even in places that are, politically in very bad shape, we'll have usually some kind of movie industry, okay? But I think that the sophistication of the industry, how it's dealt with is, in a lot of places is just not developed. And usually it takes some government help. I mean, you can tell, like in Europe, every country gets these big tax, schemes to be able to make films. The United States is really an outlier that way. We don't treat film like an art form. We treat it like a commercial venture. But in many, many countries, and the countries where you think of when you think of good films, the European countries, some now in Asian countries, and it's starting to be in African countries too. There's a lot of government support for the industry because they know that they need to kind of build it up. Oh, the government does not own the copyright, but they provide some financing.
There is a provision in copyright law outside the United States called droit moral, moral rights, which we don't have moral rights in the United States, but it actually is more protection for the filmmakers than as a result of the copyright laws being different. But the other thing that's different is that in a lot of European countries, I mean, this is not true in a lot of parts of the world, but in the European countries, they do a lot better job of taking care of their film heritage. They believe really strongly that it is part of their cultural heritage as opposed to just a business proposition. So if you go to places like Italy or France or Germany or England, there's a lot of money available for restoration and for making sure that these movies don't disappear. We're unfortunately in a capitalist country that doesn't believe in this stuff. So
what I meant was from the American distributors, because that happened with Orson Welles' last movie. He made it in like 1970 something with the support of other countries, but it took 40 something years for American distributors to basically be able to release that movie. My question was specifically from the American distributors' standpoint. So.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that, but I don't know why that would be the case.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about Orson Welles' movie that was released like 3 or 4 years ago, yeah, I mean, that one was, I mean, the backstory it's a very similar situation to what we're talking about, where the rights were tied up because he kept switching who was financing the movie, and they kept selling it from one place to another, and then it turned out that some rich guy who had loaned him money for the movie felt like it was never going to get made, and he took all the original material and locked it up in a closet. And I mean, there were incredible stories like that about a lot of fabled movies that, and the person who finally put that movie together and released it, they spent years and years and years trying to track things down and get releases from the right people and etc. It's too bad the movie wasn't better, but yeah.
I mean, this is super fascinating because what it speaks to is kind of like the fragility of the archive in the hands of private businesses. And so, like, how do you all see kind of the ideal storage of our archives? Like, who would it, with art objects that exist in institutions, sometimes private, sometimes public. So how would it look like? What could it look like for movies?
You're talking about technically? Like the technical
storage of elements and things.
Yeah, I guess both, because it does have to exist physically.
Yeah.
I mean, UCLA has something. I mean, they do have, and one of the things that we're dealing with at the DGA was there used to be a provision in Director Guild contracts that a print, a film print or 35, whatever it is, would go to UCLA and be stored. But very shortly after that provision went into the contracts, most people stopped making films on film. And there was no provision for anything on digital. So there needs to be, I mean, and really there should be, like in Britain, there's most countries have national film institutions, and America doesn't, which is, they have the Washington Library of Congress, but they have many.
There's Marty.
And there's Marty. And there's Marty, really, I wonder what Marty's gonna, there should be, single-handedly, there should be a government.
We have the Academy Museum that is also approaches us for prints and negatives.
Yes, and I think there should be, in a way, a focus on what is going to be the sort, like who's going to be the sort of standard bearer for preservation of film. Right now, there's several different ones.
Yeah, there's a preservation, a National Preservation Foundation, I think it's called, that's having these conversations with this attorney, Schwartz, who's helping me on the pro bono legal side. And he's very involved with this, and on the digital side too, it becomes very technical and very, very like, it's all about like refrigeration and things like that, and the size of the storage units that they can have and so forth. So there are individual efforts being made, but like Mary said, I mean, there's no central place in this country, and that's why also the rights and the materials can get completely separated, and the people who have the material often just don't even know who has the rights.
Yeah, and what you don't want to happen is what happened in silent film, where so much of the material is lost.
Right.
And right now, I think we were just talking about this, is we have to decide what is the format on which digital should be preserved.
Right.
You're next, yes.
Wow, so that's like kind of uncanny, because I had two questions. The first one was, I'm from Britain, we have a British Film Institute National Archive. I know in India they have a National Archive. So I was trying to get my head around, it's so much the heritage of the US, it seems obvious that there should be a National Archive. So that was going to be my first question. And then my second question was going to be, is digitization a friend or foe to missing movies? And I think you've kind of answered that to some extent, but maybe you could expand a bit more. Digitization makes it easier to distribute and copy, but also easier to delete. So what's the
That's right. Yeah. I mean, you're 100% right to think of it as two separate things, because in order to exploit the movie, to make money on a movie, to get it out into circulation, digitization at this moment is 100% necessary. But the right technical format to preserve a movie, there are formats that people are kind of moving into, that can preserve the ones and zeros, which is what we're really talking about. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it is up in the air at the moment.
A lot more work needs to be done. It's great to just have an audience of people that are interested.
So, okay, I think we have time for one more question, and there it is. Yep.
Beautiful question. Yeah, really beautiful. Well, it was a great joy to restore it and to do justice to what we had. Also, it was Mississippi Masala was shot by the legendary cinematographer Ed Lachman, and he's right here, and he loves not here tonight, but downtown, and he's he also believes so much in what we're talking about and restoration and so on. So we didn't try to do anything different, like colorize it or do it this. We just used the current technology to make sure that the film was as luminous and as saturated in some cases as we wanted as possible. There was a lot more interesting work done on the sound. Again, not to make it different in any way, but simply to make it heard anew, and the technology is obviously a big part of that. So that was the joy of it, and I have to say, because it's Criterion too, they take great care. So it was like a week love fest, to sort of massage every frame into being. And because it was also not in bad condition at all, that it really was using the 4K to help us come back to a life possibly better than the life in some ways, because it was emulsion, it was 35 initially, so it gave us a lot of latitude to make it work, that wonderfully dreamy thing that happens with emulsion versus digital, that did happen with us. I just want to say another thing, because we're talking about archives. Once the search for the Mississippi Masala negative started in March 2020, and then the pandemic hit and everyone, what happened to all of us. And so it began this idea of archiving, what I had of all my films, and I've been working for 40 years, and I didn't even realize that, how long it had been, So I did spend time during that pandemic time to store all my work one by one, all the things that I owned, from scripts to photographs to whatever, the whole 9 yards on each film, and I turned up having quite a lot of everything. And because I went on long ago on a scholarship to Harvard, I had this association with the university, and completely coincidentally, the university reached out to me to store and to buy or whatever, to acquire my papers. And that's when I went on this, like a little bit of a circuit to understand the earlier question of the gentleman, where do you store, what do you do, to understand which university archives are interested in filmmakers and independent filmmakers. I mean, there was the UCLA, there was some connection, I remember Michigan being another, but Harvard I chose because it had, in a sense, changed my life by inviting me over here and giving me that education. So, and they were just state of the art in terms of archiving. And so now they possess all my papers, which I've now, found from all the 3 countries I live in India and East Africa and here. And they have everything is so beautifully documented and saved and cataloged that I also asked them that if there were some negatives available, not negatives, prints available of different films, whether they would store them. Because I haven't found that here. I mean, you have to pay for storage, as I do, but I haven't found an archive, unlike the Academy, which would actually keep prints and have them for usage. And I'm trying to dovetail that into the university archive as well. Just to let you know that we all matter, and we should preserve our work.
Yeah, and here I think that what seems the main archives are academic archives for film, and you can, a lot of filmmakers do make arrangements with a particular university or particular archive too, and hopefully that would include the papers as well and the script, so that everything is under one roof. And usually there's some use that the students can make of it, and sometimes they'll do an exhibits or they'll exhibit the films and so forth as well. So it's not just sitting in a closet somewhere. It is there for study for the students.
And I would hope that eventually there will be an academic institution or some institution that will dedicate itself to the more marginalized films, the films that didn't get a release or got a very small release because they were from filmmakers who were sort of excluded at the time, but whose films are so relevant, and there's been a lot of that with early black cinema, but there's lots of films happening now and for the last 50 years, and I don't think that I don't know that there's an institution that's really dedicated to that.
Well, thank you, all 3 of you, for being here today, and thank you all for coming out.